The knife was at John Sutton's throat before his eyes even opened. "Do not move, Saltman," growled a voice like gravel dragged through honey, "or I finish what the cliff started." John's heart slammed against his ribs. He lay flat on his back on a bed of furs he didn't remember lying down in a stone cottage he didn't remember entering, with a blade pressed cold against his windpipe and a shadow the size of a doorway leaning over him. His head throbbed like a smith had used it for an anvil. Memory came back in jagged pieces. The pass, the rockslide, the scream of his mule, the world tipping sideways into white pain. "I mean you no harm," he managed, voice cracking. "I do not even know where I am." The knife did not move. Neither did the woman holding it, not for 3 long heartbeats. Then slowly gray-green fingers eased back and the blade lifted away from his skin. "You are in my house," she said. "You fell from the goat trail above Widow's Drop with 100 pounds of salt and spice strapped to a dying mule. The mule is dead. You are not. Be grateful and be still." John blinked the room into focus. Stone walls, a low fire, strings of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, and above him, filling the small space like a storm-given shape, stood the largest, most striking woman he had ever seen in his life. She was an orc. There was no mistaking the sloped brow, the strong jaw, the twin tusks curving up from her lower lip. But there was nothing crude about her. Her skin was a deep mossy green, smooth and gleaming faintly in the firelight, stretched over shoulders built for hauling nets or splitting wood. She wore a fitted leather bodice laced tight up the front, dark hide worked soft and supple, cut close to a waist that curved sharp before flaring to powerful hips, with leather trousers tucked into boots crossed at the ankle where she crouched over him. A long braid of black hair, threaded through with small bone beads, fell over one shoulder. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were a startling amber, sharp with suspicion and something else he could not yet name. "Who are you?" he asked. "Gorza Darkwolf." She said it like a challenge, like she expected him to flinch at the surname. "And you are the fool who tried to cross the goat trail during a storm." "John Sutton," he said. "Trader. Salt and spice mostly between the lowland markets and the coast towns." He tried to sit up and the room spun. She put a broad hand flat on his chest and pushed him back down without effort, as though he weighed nothing at all. "You have a cracked head and 2 broken ribs," she said. "You will lie there until I say otherwise." "That an order?" "That is a fact." Something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "Humans, always so eager to die proving they are not weak." John let his head fall back against the furs and stared up at the smoke-blackened rafters. His whole body ached in a dozen new places. "Well," he said, "I suppose I owe you my life then." "You owe me nothing," Gorza said, rising to her feet in one smooth motion that made the small cottage feel smaller still. "I did not pull you off that ledge for your gratitude. I pulled you off it because I was not in the mood to listen to a man scream himself hoarse all night before the crows got to him." "Practical," John said. "Practical keeps you alive out here," she said. "Sentiment gets you killed." She turned and busied herself at the hearth, and John watched her without meaning, to the width of her shoulders, the confident economy of her movements, the way even something as ordinary as stirring a pot of broth seemed to carry a kind of coiled power, like a big cat pretending to be tame. He had traded through a dozen border towns in his life, and had seen orcs before, mostly at a wary distance, mostly armed and unfriendly, mostly on the other side of some old grudge nobody living had started but everybody still nursed. He had never been alone in a room with one. He had certainly never had one save his life. "Where exactly is here?" he asked. "Scarrow's Reach," she said without turning. "The Tide Island, you have heard of it?" He had. Every trader on the coast road had. A jagged spit of rock and heather off the northern shoreline, connected to the mainland by a causeway of packed shingle that vanished twice a day beneath the sea. Half village, half fortress, home to a stubborn scatter of fisherfolk, a few outcast orcs who had married into human families generations back, and if the stories were true, more secrets than souls. "I was trying to reach it," John admitted. "There is a trading post here, I heard. Man named Cobb who buys salt at good prices and does not ask too many questions." "Cobb is dead," Gorza said flatly. "3 months now. The Skinner band killed him." John pushed up onto his elbows despite the pain lancing through his ribs. "The Skinner band, the outlaws that have been raiding the coast road. The same." She turned then, and the firelight carved hard shadows beneath her cheekbones, making her look older, wearier than the strength of her body suggested. "They have taken 3 farms and burned a granary. They took a girl from Millhaven and no one has seen her since. And they have started coming here to the Reach when the tide is out and no one can escape by land or sea." Her jaw tightened. "They think because half the people here are orcs or married to orcs or born of orcs that no one beyond the causeway will care what happens to us. They are not entirely wrong." John lay back down slowly, processing this. Outlaws, a dead trading partner, a dangerous woman with sharp amber eyes who had, for reasons of her own, decided he was worth saving. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "About Cobb, and about the girl." Gorza studied him for a long moment, as if surprised the words had come at all. "Sleep, Saltman," she said finally. "You will need your strength if you mean to be useful to anyone." He did not remember falling asleep. He only remembered, much later, that it was the first night in longer than he cared to admit that he had not felt entirely alone. The days that followed blurred into a slow, careful rhythm. John's ribs mended stubbornly, and Gorza tended them with a rough competence that brooked no argument, trapping his chest with strips of boiled linen, forcing bitter teas down his throat that tasted of willow bark and something else he could not identify, threatening to break the other set of ribs herself if he tried to get up before she permitted it. He learned, in fits and starts, the shape of her life. She was not native to the Reach. She had come 3 years past from a war camp in the eastern hills, exiled by her own clan for reasons she would not discuss, and had built her cottage on the windward side of the island with her own hands, stone by stone. She fished. She kept goats. She traded dried fish and goat cheese with the handful of other households scattered across the island. And she was, by every account he gathered from the wary but curious neighbors who came to check on the strange human sheltering in her house, the only person on Scarrows Reach the Skinner band had not yet dared to rob twice. "They tried the first winter I was here," she told him one evening, sitting across the hearth from him while she sharpened a long skinning knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "4 of them. They thought an orc woman alone would be easy plunder. What happened? 3 of them left with fewer fingers than they arrived with," she said, without looking up. "The 4th did not leave at all." John absorbed that in silence, watching the firelight slide along the blade in her hands, and found, to his own surprise, that he was not afraid. He believed her. He had also, somewhere in the last handful of days, stopped seeing the tusks and the green skin and the size of her, and started seeing simply her, the particular furrow of concentration between her brows, the low satisfied hum she made when a knot in the fishing net finally gave way, the surprising gentleness of her hands when she changed his bandages despite their strength. "You are staring," she said, not looking up from the blade. "I am recovering," he said. "Staring is all I am fit for." That earned him the barest huff of something that might have been laughter, quickly smothered. "Flattery will not make your ribs heal faster." "No," he agreed, "but it might make the healing more pleasant." She looked up then, amber eyes catching his across the fire, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The wind outside pushed at the shutters and the fire popped, and John felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with broken bone. "You talk too much for a man who nearly died a week ago," Gorza said at last, but there was no bite in it, only something warmer, something that made his pulse quicken despite himself. "It is a trader's curse," he said. "We are only useful with our mouths." "We shall see how useful," she said, and went back to her knife. But he did not miss the small curve that had crept onto her lips, nor the fact that she did not look away quite as quickly as she might have a week before. By the 2nd week, John was walking again, slow and careful, out along the wind-scoured paths that threaded the island between heather and gorse. Gorza walked beside him without seeming to, always a half-step behind or ahead, always somehow exactly where he might need a steadying hand without ever making him feel weak for needing it. She showed him where the tide pools filled with mussels at low water, showed him the ruined watchtower on the island's northern point where, she said, sentries had once watched for raiders from the sea before the old kingdom fell to squabbling and neglect, showed him the narrow shingle causeway that connected the reach to the mainland, a ribbon of packed stone and sand that vanished entirely beneath 6 feet of churning water twice a day, cutting the island off from the world as surely as a drawn bridge. Anyone caught on that causeway when the tide turns does not make it across, she told him, standing with her hands on her hips at the island's edge, watching the gray water creep up over the stones even now. It comes fast, faster than a man can run most days. Sounds like a fine defense against outlaws, John observed. It would be, Gorza said, if the Skinner band did not know the tide tables better than the fisherfolk do. John looked at her sharply. You think they will come here in force? I think, she said, that Cobb's death and the burned granary were not the end of it. I think they are building towards something. And I think when they will come at low tide, when the reach cannot call for help and cannot run. The wind pulled a strand of dark hair loose from her braid, and she did not push it back, standing instead with her arms crossed, jaw set, staring out at the gray, restless sea as though she could read the outlaw's plans written on its surface. John found himself studying the strong line of her profile, the tusks that no longer struck him as fearsome but simply as hers, as much a part of her as her sharp eyes or her low, rough voice, and felt a fierce and sudden protectiveness rise in him that startled him with its intensity. He had known this woman 2 weeks. He had no business feeling anything so large. Then we should be ready, he said instead, whatever that means. She glanced sideways at him, something assessing in her look as though weighing him against some private measure. We, she repeated. You saved my life, John said simply. I'm not in the habit of leaving debts unpaid, and besides, he hesitated, then pushed on because something about the wind and the gray sea and her nearness made honesty easier than it usually was. Besides, I find I do not much want to leave yet. Gorza said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, in a voice stripped of its usual gruffness, the tide will not let you leave for 3 more days regardless, Saltman, so do not make it sound so noble. But she did not move away when he stepped closer, and when his shoulder brushed hers, she did not pull back, and they stood together at the island's edge until the cold drove them back toward the cottage and its fire. It was 2 nights later that the whispered confession happened, though neither of them called it that at the time. They sat together on the cottage floor, close by the banked embers of the hearth, sharing a single blanket against the deepening chill, because the wind had found some new gap in the shutters, and the fire alone was not enough. John's ribs had healed enough that the ache was mostly memory now, but he had made no move to find lodging elsewhere on the island, and Gorza had made no move to suggest he should. The silence between them had become comfortable in a way that startled him every time he noticed it, the way an old ache startles you by its absence. Tell me why your clan exiled you, he said into the dark, quiet enough that she could pretend not to have heard if she chose. For a long time she said nothing, and he thought perhaps she would let the silence stand as answer. Then, low and rough, I refused a marriage. John turned his head against the blanket to look at her profile, lit faint orange by the dying fire. That seems a small thing to be cast out for. It was not a small marriage. Her jaw worked. The chief's son, a brute of a man who thought a wife was something to be won like plunder, not chosen. My father had already given his word. I had not given mine. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, bitter and short. I broke his nose at the betrothal feast in front of the whole camp. My father called it shame. I called it the only honest thing anyone did that night. So they threw you out. They gave me a choice, she corrected. Marry him or leave with nothing but what I could carry. I chose nothing. She turned her head then, and in the dim light her amber eyes found his, searching, wary as though bracing for judgment. Does that frighten you? That I am the kind of woman who breaks noses instead of bending. John thought about it honestly before he answered because she deserved honesty and nothing less. No, he said finally, it makes me admire you. I have spent my whole life bending to prices I did not set, to roads I did not choose, to a trade that swallowed my father and will likely swallow me too if the mountain passes do not do it first. I do not think I have ever once in 31 years broken anything in defense of my own worth. He paused. I think that might be the braver thing, actually. Bending is easy. It is what is expected. Breaking takes a kind of courage I do not know if I have. Gorza was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made his skin warm despite the cold room. You underestimate yourself, Salt Man, she said finally, softer than he had ever heard her speak. You climbed a goat trail in a storm rather than lose your goods to the tide schedule. You have stood beside me at the edge of this island talking of outlaws as though you mean to fight them, though you have never held a blade in your life that was not for cutting rope or bread. That is not nothing. That is stubbornness, not courage. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps they are the same thing, worn different ways. The fire popped low in the hearth. Outside, the wind had dropped to a low, constant moan against the shutters, and the cottage felt very small and very warm, and John was aware, with sudden and total clarity, of exactly how close her mouth was to his in the dark. Gorza, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Do not, she said, but it was not a command, it was almost a plea, and her eyes had dropped to his mouth in a way that undid every ounce of restraint he had left. Do not what? Do not say something a human trader has no business saying to an orc woman he has known 2 weeks, she said, but she had not moved away, and her breath had gone unsteady, and one broad hand had found its way to the front of his shirt, not pushing him back this time but holding on. I do not care how long I have known you, John said quietly. I have spent my whole life passing through places, never staying anywhere long enough to matter to anyone. And then I fell off a cliff, and a woman with amber eyes and more courage than anyone I have ever met decided I was worth saving. I think he swallowed hard. I think I am already lost to you, Gorza Darkwolf. I do not know when it happened. I only know it has. For a moment she said nothing, only looked at him with an expression he could not read, something fierce and wondering and frightened all at once, an expression that looked strange on a face built for confidence and command. No one has ever said such a thing to me, she said finally, low and raw. Men fear me, or they want to own me the way the chief's son wanted to own me. No one has ever simply wanted me, not like this. I want you, John said, and it came out steadier than he felt, steady with the certainty of a man who had finally, after 31 wandering years, found the one fixed point in his life. Not despite what you are, Gorza, because of it. She made a sound low in her throat, something between a growl and a sob, and then her hand tightened in his shirt and pulled him forward, and her mouth found his in the dark with a hunger that stole the breath clean out of his lungs. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, searching, tasting of wood smoke and salt, and something fiercely alive. Her tusks a strange new sensation against his lip that he found, to his own astonishment, he did not mind at all, only wanted more of, wanted closer, wanted everything she was willing to give. He brought a hand up to cup her jaw, feeling the strength banked beneath her skin, and she leaned into his palm like something starved finally being fed. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she pressed her forehead against his, tusks brushing his cheek, and laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, utterly unguarded. You are a fool, John Sutton, she murmured. I have been told. A brave fool, she amended, and kissed him again, slower this time, savoring, and John Sutton understood, with the fire dying low and the wind howling outside and this fierce, magnificent woman in his arms, that he had found the thing every lonely road he had ever walked had been leading him toward. They did not speak of what would come after, not that night. That night belonged only to them, a private world of two carved out against the wind and the dark, and neither of them was in any hurry to leave it. Morning came gray and ordinary, and with it, trouble. John woke to raised voices outside the cottage, several of them, sharp with fear and anger. He sat up fast, wincing at the twinge in his healing ribs, and found Gorza already at the window, one hand on the long skinning knife at her belt, her body coiled tight with the particular stillness of a predator assessing a threat. "What is it?" "Tam Fenner's boat did not come back from the fishing grounds last night," she said grimly. "And old Marrow says he saw riders on the mainland shore at dusk, a dozen or more." John's stomach dropped. "The Skinner band. We will know soon enough." They dressed quickly, and Gorza pulled on over her leather bodice a short cloak of oiled wool against the wind, though it did nothing to soften the impression she made striding out of the cottage, tall, broad-shouldered, tusks catching the pale morning light. Every inch the warrior the outlaws would be fools to underestimate. John followed a half-step behind, feeling suddenly and acutely the absence of any weapon in his own hands, a trader's habits ill-suited to whatever was coming. They found a knot of villagers gathered at the causeway's edge, staring across the exposed shingle at the mainland shore, where indeed a cluster of riders sat their horses in a loose line, watching back. Even at this distance John could make out the crude, mismatched armor, the array of weapons, the general air of men who had made violence their trade. At their front, a rangy figure with a long scar bisecting one eyebrow raised a hand in something between a greeting and a taunt. "That is Harker," muttered a stooped fisherman John recognized as Old Marrow. "Skinner's second. If he is here, Skinner himself will not be far." "What do they want?" John asked. "Tribute," spat a younger woman with a baby on her hip, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "They want us to pay them not to burn what is left standing." "And if we do not have coin," she did not finish the sentence, but her eyes flicked toward the cottages behind her, toward the goats and the stores of dried fish, toward everything a family on this windswept rock had managed to scrape together. Gorza's jaw tightened. "The tide will cover that causeway within the hour," she said. "They cannot cross now even if they wanted to. This is theater. They want us afraid before they ever set foot here." As if in answer, Harker cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted across the widening water, his voice carrying thin and mocking on the wind. "Tell the orc bitch we have not forgotten her. Tell her Skinner remembers the men she killed, and he means to collect on that debt in full when the tide allows it. 3 days hence, when the water runs low at midday, we will be waiting on your shore, Scarrow's Reach, and we will not be leaving empty-handed." A murmur of fear rippled through the gathered villagers. John looked at Gorza and saw her face had gone hard and still, but beneath the stillness in the set of her shoulders, he saw something else, not fear, but a fierce, calculating fury, the look of a woman already counting the ways she might make Harker regret every word. 3 days, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. 3 days to prepare for a dozen armed men, John said. How does a fishing village and a handful of goat keepers prepare for that? Gorza turned to look at him, and something in her expression had shifted, resolve settling over fury like a lid over a boiling pot. "Not alone," she said. "There is a garrison at Millhaven, half a day's ride inland. If someone rode there and back before the tide turned against them, they might bring soldiers, enough to even the numbers. Who would ride that fast?" "I would," Gorza said. "I will not leave this island undefended with Harker's threat still ringing in everyone's ears, and I will not send a stranger to speak for us to soldiers who do not know his face and will not trust it." John understood, with a lurch of cold clarity, what she was not quite asking. "You want me to go?" "I want you safe," she said, low and fierce, gripping his arm. "And I want this island safe. I cannot have both if I go myself. You know how to talk to strangers, John Sutton, it is your trade. Ride to Millhaven. Tell the garrison commander what threatens the Reach. Bring back whoever will come. And if the tide catches me on the way back, then do not let it," she said, and though her voice was rough with command, her eyes, when they met his, were naked with fear for him, plain and unhidden, a magnificent warrior laid bare by worry for one ordinary trader. "Come back to me, John. Whatever else happens on that road, come back to me." He kissed her then, in front of the gathered villagers, in front of Old Marrow and the young mother with the baby on her hip, and everyone else who might have something to say about a human trader and an orc woman standing so close together, and he did not care one bit what any of them thought. "I will come back," he said. "I promise you that." The ride to Millhaven was the hardest thing John had done in years, not for its danger, though there was danger enough on a lonely inland road with outlaws roaming loose, but for the gnawing fear that gripped him the entire way, the fear that he would not reach the garrison in time, or that the garrison would not care, or that he would return to find the Reach already burning. He rode a borrowed horse hard through the gray afternoon, reciting in his head the words he would need to convince a garrison commander, who owed the Reach nothing to spend soldiers on its defense. The commander, a weathered woman named Captain Adara Voss with iron-gray hair cropped close, and a face that had clearly seen too many border skirmishes to be easily moved by a stranger's plea, listened to his breathless account with a skeptical frown. "Scarrow's Reach," she said slowly. "Half orc, is it not? Since when does the Crown's garrison ride to defend a settlement that is half made of the enemy we spent 30 years fighting?" John felt anger flare hot and sudden in his chest, sharper than he expected. "They are not the enemy," he said. "They are fisherfolk and goat herders and honest traders trying to survive on a windswept rock, same as anyone else in this kingdom, and the only difference between them and Millhaven is the shape of some of their ears. The Skinner band does not care what shape your ears are when they burn your granary and steal your daughters. Neither should you." Captain Voss studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp eyes. "You feel strongly about this?" "I love a woman on that island," John said simply, because there was no more time for careful words, no more time for anything but the plain truth. "An orc woman named Gorza Darkwolf, who pulled me off a cliff with her own 2 hands and has done nothing since but prove herself worth 10 of any man I have ever met. She is standing on that shingle right now, organizing whatever defense a handful of farmers and fishwives can manage, because she will not run, and she will not let her neighbors be slaughtered. I am asking you to give her people the chance she has already given everyone she has ever met, the chance to be judged by what they do, not what they are." The room was silent. Then Captain Voss let out a long breath and rubbed a hand over her weathered face. "Skinner's band has been a thorn in this whole region's side for a year now," she admitted. "The Crown would not weep to see them broken, regardless of who does the breaking or where. 20 men, sergeant's choice, and myself besides. That is what I can spare, and it is more than I should, but—" She fixed John with a hard look. "You had better be right about that tide schedule, trader. I will not throw good soldiers into the sea to prove a point." They rode through the night, John half blind with exhaustion but too afraid to rest, and reached the mainland shore opposite Scarrow's Reach just as the gray dawn light began to spread across the water, and just as the tide, obligingly, had drawn back enough to bear the shingle causeway once more. Gorza was waiting at the far end of it, standing exactly where he had left her 3 days before, as though she had not moved, as though she had willed him back across that stretch of water by sheer force of need. When she saw the column of soldiers behind him, something in her whole body seemed to loosen, some tension she had carried alone finally allowed to ease. John dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and crossed the last stretch of shingle at a run, and she met him halfway, catching him up in an embrace that lifted his boots clean off the stones, tusks pressed against his temple, her whole body shaking with something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears. "You came back," she breathed against his hair. "I told you I would," he said, muffled against her shoulder, and did not care that Captain Voss and 20 soldiers were watching, did not care about anything at all except the solid, living warmth of her arms around him. The 3 days before Skinner's promised arrival passed in a blur of preparation. Captain Voss, true to her word, set her soldiers to fortifying the narrow approaches to the village, and Gorza worked alongside them with a competence that quickly won even the most skeptical soldiers' grudging respect, directing the placement of sharpened stakes along the shingle, organizing the fisherfolk into teams to move valuables and children to the old watchtower on the northern point, testing the timing of the tides again and again until she could recite to the minute when the water would rise and fall on the day Skinner's men meant to strike. John found his own uses too, though they surprised him. His years of trading had taught him to read men quickly, to gauge desperation and greed and fear in a glance, and he spent long hours with Captain Voss poring over what little was known of Skinner's band, their numbers, their habits, the string of raids that had brought them steadily closer to the coast. It was John who noticed the pattern nobody else had. Skinner never struck at full strength on the first approach. He sent a smaller party first to test defenses, to draw out the desperate and the brave before committing the whole band. "Harker's threat," John said, spreading a rough charcoal map across the table in the garrison tent Captain Voss had ordered raised near the causeway. He said Skinner himself would come at low tide midday 3 days hence, but if this pattern holds, that first wave will not be the whole band, it will be a probe. Skinner will hold the rest back, watching from the mainland shore, ready to commit fully only once he sees how hard we fight. Captain Voss frowned over the map. Then the true danger comes after the first clash once he has measured us. "Which means," Gorza said slowly, arriving at the same thought a half-beat behind him, "that if we let the probe succeed too easily, Skinner grows bold and commits everything at once, into ground we have already prepared. And if we make the probe too costly," John finished, "he grows wary and picks us apart slowly instead, over weeks, the way he has picked apart every other village on this coast." Captain Voss looked between them, something like respect dawning in her weathered face. "You are saying we should let them win the first fight." "I am saying we should let them think they have," Gorza said, a fierce and dangerous smile spreading across her face, tusks gleaming. "And then break every bone in Skinner's plan when he brings the rest across." The plan that emerged over the following 2 days was risky, and it depended on a dozen small things going exactly right. And John found himself, despite his complete lack of soldierly training, standing at the center of it. Not because anyone had asked him to lead, but because he was the one who had seen the pattern, and because Gorza would not let him stand aside even if he had wanted to. "You have a traitor's eyes," she told him, the night before Skinner's men were due, as they lay together in the cottage that had somehow, in the space of 3 short weeks, become simply theirs. "You see what things are worth, what men will risk and what they will not. That is a rarer gift on a battlefield than a strong sword arm." "I do not have a sword arm at all," John said dryly. "No," she agreed, tracing a finger along his jaw with surprising tenderness. "But you have this." She tapped his temple. "And this." Her hand moved to rest flat over his heart. "Those will serve you and serve this island better than any blade." He caught her hand and pressed it there, holding it against the steady beat beneath his ribs. "This belongs to you now," he said quietly. "All of it, whatever happens tomorrow." "Nothing will happen to you tomorrow," she said fiercely, "because I will not allow it." And there was such raw conviction in her voice that he almost believed the world itself would not dare defy her. They did not sleep much that night, and what sleep came was tangled together beneath the single blanket, her arm heavy and warm across his chest, his face pressed into the curve of her neck, both of them memorizing the shape of the other against the uncertainty of the coming day. The attack came exactly as predicted, a probing force of perhaps 8 riders crossing the shingle at midday, when the tide sat at its lowest ebb, confident and unhurried, expecting to find frightened fisherfolk and easy plunder. Instead, they found sharpened stakes forcing them into narrow lanes between the cottages, and soldiers concealed behind stone walls, and a defense that yielded ground slowly, convincingly, exactly as John and Gorza had planned, enough resistance to seem real, not enough to seem impossible. John watched from the old watchtower with Captain Voss, tracking the fight through the confusion of dust and shouting, and saw the moment the outlaw probe, satisfied they had found a village worth conquering, wheeled and rowed back across the causeway to signal the rest. "Now Skinner commits," Captain Voss murmured. "Now we find out if we were right," John said, and his heart hammered against his ribs as the mainland shore, previously still, erupted into motion a much larger force, 30 men or more, spurring their horses onto the shingle as the tide, patient and merciless, had already begun its slow crawl back toward the land. This was the part of the plan that made John's stomach knot with dread even as it unfolded exactly as they had hoped. Skinner's men, flush with the false confidence of their probe's success, rode hard across the causeway at full strength, directly into the trap that had been baited for them, and directly into the window of time when the returning tide would make retreat across that same causeway a desperate gamble against rising water. The battle that followed was not the clean, controlled skirmish John had imagined in the safety of planning sessions. It was chaos horses screaming, steel ringing against steel, the sharpened stakes doing brutal work in the narrow lanes, soldiers and villagers fighting shoulder to shoulder in a way that erased, for those desperate minutes, every old prejudice about who belonged and who did not. John saw old Marrow, of all people, brain an outlaw with a fishing gaff. He saw the young mother with the baby, her child now safely hidden in the watchtower, fighting beside Captain Voss's soldiers with a boat hook gripped in both white-knuckled hands. And he saw Gorza. She fought like something out of an old war song, tireless and terrible and magnificent, her long knife flashing, her voice raised in a battle cry that carried over the din and rallied every frightened villager within earshot. John, stationed with a handful of others at the causeway's mainland end, to prevent any outlaw slipping past the main fight and threatening the watchtower where the children sheltered, watched her with his heart in his throat, torn between terror for her safety and a fierce, soaring pride that had no room left for fear. It was there, at the causeway's edge, that John found himself face to face with Harker himself, the scarred lieutenant who had shouted his threats across the water 3 days before, now unhorsed and furious, blade in hand, blocking the path of 2 terrified children trying to reach the watchtower. John had no sword. He had a boat hook, snatched up in desperation, and 31 years of a body built for hauling salt sacks rather than fighting men. "Out of my way, traitor," Harker snarled, "or you die where you stand." "Not while those children are behind me," John said, and was surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Harker lunged. John got the boat hook up just in time, deflecting the blade with a clumsy, desperate parry that sent pain lancing up his arm, and then instinct took over where skill failed. He drove the hooked end of the tool into Harker's shoulder with all the strength his trading years had built into him, and the outlaw staggered back with a howl of pain and fury. It should have ended badly for John in the next instant. Harker recovered fast, blade raised for a killing strike, and John, off balance from his own swing, had no way to block it. Gorza's knife took Harker in the side before the strike could fall, and she was there suddenly, bloody and fierce and utterly unstoppable, wrenching the outlaw around to face her. "You threatened my island," she snarled, amber eyes blazing. "You threatened my people, and you dared raise a blade against my man." Harker did not survive what came next. John looked away, his stomach turning, but he did not look away fast enough to miss the moment Gorza turned from the fallen outlaw and found him standing there, whole and alive, and the raw relief that broke across her fierce features like sunrise breaking over storm clouds. The battle turned soon after. With Harker fallen and their numbers badly thinned by the stakes and the ambush, and with the tide now rising fast and inexorable across the causeway behind them, the remaining outlaws broke and fled toward the mainland shore, splashing through water already climbing past their horses' knees. Some made it, some did not. Skinner himself, John learned later from a captured lieutenant too frightened and battered to lie, had watched the disaster unfold from a safe distance on the mainland ridge, and had already fled north with what remained of his band, the myth of his invincibility broken as surely as his lieutenant's nose had been broken at the causeway's edge. It was over. John stood in the wreckage of the fight-broken stakes, trampled heather, the bodies of the fallen already being gathered with a grim, practiced efficiency by Captain Voss's soldiers, and felt the shaking exhaustion of survival hit him all at once, his knees threatening to give. Gorza reached him before he fell, catching him up against her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply held on, breathing hard, hearts hammering against each other's chests, alive in a world that had very nearly ended for both of them an hour before. "You are hurt," she said finally, pulling back just far enough to check him over with rough, urgent hands. "Nothing that will not mend," John said. "You, on the other hand," he touched a shallow cut along her cheekbone that he had only just noticed, blood drying dark against her green skin. "A scratch." She caught his hand before it could linger, pressed it instead flat against her chest, over her heart, the same gesture he had offered her the night before. "This is what matters. It is still beating. So is yours. That is enough." Around them, the villagers of Scarrow's Reach had begun to emerge from their shelters, disbelieving at first, then slowly, tentatively, breaking into cheers and embraces as the scope of the victory became clear. Old Marrow was being clapped on the back by soldiers who, 3 days before, would not have spared him a second glance. The young mother had her baby back in her arms, tears streaming freely down her face. Captain Voss, blood-spattered and grim, surveyed the field with the tired satisfaction of a soldier who had won a fight she had genuinely believed might be lost. John looked around at all of it, the strange, unlikely alliance of fisherfolk and orcs and soldiers who had, for one desperate afternoon, forgotten every old prejudice in the simple shared work of survival, and felt something settle deep in his chest, a certainty that had been building for weeks finally arriving at its full weight. "Gorza," he said. She looked at him, still catching her breath, still fierce with the aftermath of battle, and something in his tone made her still entirely. "What is it?" "Marry me," John said. "Not because of the battle or the danger or because we nearly died today, though the gods know that has certainly clarified my thinking. Marry me because I have never in my life felt as certain of anything as I feel certain of you. Marry me because you are the bravest, most magnificent woman I have ever known, and because somehow, impossibly, you seem to want me too. And I do not intend to spend one more day of my life pretending. I do not want that with everything I have." For a long moment Gorza said nothing, and John's heart pounded with a fear far sharper than anything the battle had inspired. Then her face broke into a wide, radiant smile, tusks and all, and she laughed, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, that turned heads across the battlefield. "You ask me this," she said, "covered in mud, holding a boat hook 3 minutes after nearly getting yourself killed by Harker. I have never claimed to have good timing." "No," she agreed, still laughing, pulling him close again. "But you have excellent aim with a boat hook and an even better aim with your heart, John Sutton. Yes, I will marry you." I would have said yes if you had asked me the very first night, bleeding and half-conscious on my furs, though I would have told you to wait until your ribs healed before we discussed it. They kissed then, amid the wreckage and the cheering and the slow settling dust of battle, and it did not matter one bit that half the island was watching, or that soldiers who had never before stood so close to an orc without weapons drawn now stood grinning at the sight, or that the old prejudices which had shaped both their lives had not vanished entirely, only cracked, for one bright afternoon, wide enough to let something better through. The weeks after the battle passed in a haze of recovery and quiet celebration. Captain Voss's soldiers remained on the Reach long enough to help rebuild what had been damaged and to escort the handful of captured outlaws back to Millhaven for judgment. And before she rode out for the last time, the captain sought out John and Gorza at the causeway's edge. "I will be recommending to the Crown that a permanent garrison be posted nearer this coast," she told them. "Skinner is broken but not dead, and there are always more like him. I will also be recommending, she hesitated, glancing at Gorza with an expression that had shed most of its former wariness, that Scarrow's Reach be recognized as what it plainly is, a settlement worth defending, regardless of the shape of its people's ears. That is more than I expected from a crowned soldier 3 weeks ago, Gorza said, not unkindly. 3 weeks ago I had not watched an orc woman save a traitor's life with a well-thrown knife, nor watched that same traitor talk a stubborn garrison commander into risking her soldiers for a village she had never once visited, Captain Voss said. People surprise you if you let them. She nodded once formally to both of them and rode out across the causeway as the tide crept in behind her. The wedding, when it came, was a small thing by the standards of grand keeps and noble houses, but it was, by every measure John cared about, the finest occasion of his life. It was held at the edge of the island, near the old ruined watchtower, with the whole of Scarrow's Reach in attendance, fisherfolk and goat herders, the handful of other orcs who had made lives on the island's margins, even old Marrow, cleaned up and solemn, who had appointed himself unofficial witness to the whole affair. There was no priest of any grand temple to officiate. Instead, following a custom Gorza explained with unusual shyness, they exchanged a private vow at dawn, cutting their palms with the same blade and pressing the wounds together, blood mingling, an old orc custom of binding that she confessed she had never once expected to perform for anyone. It means, she told him, as their blood mixed and the rising sun broke gold across the water, that from this morning forward whatever happens to one of us happens to both. There is no undoing it, not by clan law, not by crown law, not by anything but death itself. I would not undo it if I could, John said, and meant it with everything he had. They built their life together in the cottage on the windward side of the island, expanding it slowly over the following months as John's trading resumed, though he traveled less far and less often now, unwilling to be parted from Gorza for longer than necessary, and increasingly finding that other traders on the coast road were willing to meet him partway, curious and respectful of the man who had helped break the Skinner band and married an orc woman who had, by every account, personally ended Harker's career as a raider. It was on an ordinary morning, some 4 months after the wedding, that the Doorframe incident occurred, the moment that would become, in the retelling over years to come, the story Gorza loved best to tell and John loved best to hear. He had woken later than usual, sun already well up and slanting warm through the cottage's single window, and found the bed beside him empty, Gorza's side of the furs already cool. He rose, still half asleep, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders against the morning chill, and made his way toward the cottage's front door to see where she had gone, only to stop dead in the doorway, staring down at the frame itself. Carved into the old, weathered wood at roughly the height of his own eye was his name, John Sutton, cut deep and careful into the grain, the letters slightly uneven in places as though carved with great concentration, or perhaps great feeling, or both. Beside it, smaller, half-finished, as though the carver had been interrupted mid-stroke, the beginning of another word. Ghor. John stood there for a long moment, blanket forgotten around his shoulders, staring at his own name carved into the doorframe of the home he shared with his wife, feeling something well up in his chest too large for words. He found Gorza around the side of the cottage, tending the goats, a long carving knife, the very one he realized that had first pressed against his throat all those months ago, tucked into her belt. Gorza, he said, and something in his voice made her turn immediately, alert to his tone. What is it? Are you well? There is my name, he said slowly, carved into our doorframe. She went very still, and then, to his utter astonishment, a flush of green darkened her cheeks, the first time he had ever seen her look anything close to embarrassed. It was an accident, she said quickly, too quickly, setting down the water bucket she had been carrying with more force than necessary. An accident, John repeated, unable to keep the smile from spreading across his face. You carved my full name in careful letters at precisely eye height entirely by accident. I was sharpening the door hinge, she said, chin lifting in that familiar defiant tilt that he had come to love more than he could say. The knife slipped. 6 times, apparently. In the exact shape of John, it is a common shape for a knife to slip. Gorza. I do not know what you are implying, Saltman. You were carving my name into our home, John said, stepping closer, unable to keep the warmth from his voice. And you started carving your own name beside it, and you stopped because you heard me stirring and did not want me to catch you at it. That is not an accident, Gorza Darkwolf. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me in my entire life, and I would very much like you to stop pretending otherwise. For a long moment she said nothing, simply looked at him with those fierce amber eyes gone suddenly, uncharacteristically soft, and then the defiance melted out of her all at once, and she laughed, a low, helpless, delighted sound that he felt in his own chest like sunlight. Fine, she admitted. It was not an accident. I woke before dawn and could not sleep, and I found myself standing in that doorway thinking of everything that has happened since you fell off that cliff and into my life, and I wanted. She stopped, searching for words. This fierce warrior who had faced down outlaws and clan chiefs without flinching, now visibly struggling to voice something far more frightening than either. I wanted proof, she said finally. Something carved into the bones of this house that could not be argued with or taken back or explained away. Proof that you belong here, that this is not merely where you are staying between trading trips but where you live, where you are wanted. I wanted my own name beside yours so that anyone who ever stood in that doorway would know, without either of us having to say a word, exactly what we are to each other. John crossed the remaining distance between them and took her face in both his hands, tusks and all, and kissed her slowly, thoroughly, with all the tenderness he possessed. Finish it, he said against her mouth. Carve your whole name. I want it there beside mine every single day for the rest of our lives. I want anyone who ever visits this house to see it and know exactly what they are looking at the doorway of two people who chose each other, and who are not ashamed to have it carved in wood for the whole world to see. Gorza's eyes were bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears, though she would have denied it fiercely if he had named it aloud. You are certain, she said. Once it is carved, it does not come out. Not without destroying the frame entirely. I have never been more certain of anything, John said. Not the trading routes I have walked my whole life. Not even the goat trail that nearly killed me and led me to you. This I am certain of. They walked back to the cottage together, hand in hand, and John watched as Gorza took up the knife once more and finished what she had started, her own name completing itself beneath careful, steady strokes, no longer hesitant, no longer hidden, GHORZADARKWOLF, carved deep and permanent beside John SUTTON in the aged wood of the doorframe that marked the entrance to the only home either of them had ever truly wanted to stay in. When she finished, she stepped back, and together they looked at the two names carved side by side, hers bold and sure, his slightly smaller but no less certain, both of them now a permanent fixture of the house they shared. There, Gorza said, a note of fierce satisfaction in her voice. Now it is truth, not accident. Let anyone who doubts what we are to each other read it for themselves. I do not think anyone on this island doubts it any more, John said, thinking of the wedding, of the shared blood vow at dawn, of the battle they had fought together and the life they had built since. But I am glad it is written all the same. Life on Scarrow's Reach settled, in the seasons that followed, into something John had never dared hope for in all his years of solitary trading along the mountain passes. A life with roots, with a fixed point on the map that was not merely a stop between destinations, but a destination in itself. He still traveled, still hauled salt and spice along the coast road, and occasionally up into the safer mountain passes now that the Skinner band's remnants had scattered and mostly given up raiding this stretch of coast. But he always returned, and Gorza was always there waiting, sometimes at the causeway's edge if the tide allowed, sometimes standing in the doorway beneath their carved names, arms crossed, feigning patience she did not truly feel. The island itself changed too, slowly but unmistakably. Word of the battle spread along the coast road in the retelling of soldiers and traders alike, and Scarrow's Reach became known not as the half-orc backwater it had once been dismissed as, but as the place where an orc woman and a human trader had broken the Skinner band together, where soldiers and fisherfolk and orcs had fought shoulder to shoulder and found, in the fighting, something worth more than the old grudges they had inherited. More families came to settle on the island in the following year, drawn by its safety and its strange, hard-won reputation, and among them were orc families as well as human ones. And John watched with quiet pride as Gorza became something like an unofficial elder to the growing settlement, her counsel sought by fisherfolk and orc alike. Her fierce protectiveness extended now to a whole community, rather than merely one stubborn trader she had once threatened to knife. One evening, nearly a year after the wedding, they sat together on the low stone wall outside their cottage, watching the sun sink into the sea beyond the causeway, the tide already beginning its slow crawl to cut the island off from the mainland for another night. Gorza leaned into his side, her head resting against his shoulder, a rare moment of complete stillness in a life that had rarely afforded either of them much rest. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Falling off that cliff? Ending up here, with me, instead of wherever your trading roads would have taken you otherwise?" John considered the question seriously, because she deserved a serious answer, though the answer itself required no thought at all. "I think," he said, "that every road I ever walked before that cliff was simply the long way to this one. I do not regret a single mile of it because every mile brought me here to you. I would walk it all again gladly, knowing where it ends." Gorza was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone soft in the particular way it only ever did for him. "I was so certain, when my clan cast me out, that I would spend the rest of my life alone. That no one would ever want what I am too fierce, too stubborn, too willing to break things rather than bend. I built stone walls around this cottage and around myself and told myself it was enough. That solitude was simply the price of refusing to be owned by anyone." She turned her head to look at him, amber eyes catching the last of the sunset's light. "And then a foolish salt trader fell off a cliff into my life, and it turned out the price of being truly known was not solitude at all. It was simply waiting for the right person to be worth the risk. I am glad I was worth the risk," John said. "You have no idea," Gorza said, low and fierce, "how worth it you have been." And she kissed him there on the low stone wall as the last light faded, and the tide finished its slow work of cutting them off, once more from the wider world content, both of them to be cut off, to belong entirely and only to this small windswept island and to each other. Not every day was easy in the months that followed. Old prejudices did not vanish simply because one battle had been won. There were still traders along the coast road who eyed John differently once they learned who he had married, still travelers who passed through Scarrow's Reach and could not quite hide their discomfort at the sight of orc and human children playing together in the settlement's growing common square. Still, occasionally, ugly words muttered by strangers who did not know any better and did not care to learn. But John had discovered, in the year since the cliff and the causeway and the battle at low tide, that such things had lost their power to wound him the way they might have once. He had a fixed point now, a home with two names carved into its doorframe, a woman who met every slight against him with a ferocity that made most strangers reconsider their words very quickly, and he found that the weight of the world's old grudges mattered far less when balanced against the solid, daily certainty of being loved. There was one incident, some 14 months after the wedding, that tested this certainty more sharply than any other, and it was this incident that John would later consider the true, final test of everything they had built together. A trader's caravan passing along the coast rode strangers to the region, unfamiliar with what had happened at Scarrow's Reach or unwilling to care had, captured a young orc man during a dispute over grazing rights on contested land some miles inland, and rather than settling the matter through the usual channels of complaint and compensation, had chained him and dragged him toward Millhaven, intending, as word reached the reach through a frightened fisherman who had witnessed the scene, to make an example of him before a crowd already worked up into an ugly temper by rumors of orc raiders further south. Gorza heard the news standing at the market stall she had begun keeping to sell dried fish and goat cheese to travelers along the coast road, and John watched her face go through fury, calculation, and grim resolve in the space of a few heartbeats. "We cannot simply ride into Millhaven and demand a stranger's release," John said carefully, already knowing, from the set of her jaw, that she intended to do exactly that. A furious crowd looking for someone to blame will not care about reason. "I did not ask for your permission, Saltman," Gorza said, already striding toward the stable where their horses were kept. "I am asking whether you intend to come with me, or whether you intend to let me go alone." There had never really been a question of which answer he would give. They rode hard for Millhaven, arriving as the sun climbed toward midday, and found exactly the scene the fisherman had described: a young orc man, hardly more than 20 by the look of him, chained at wrists and ankles in the town square, surrounded by a crowd whose mood had curdled from anger into something closer to bloodlust, egged on by the caravan's leader, a broad-shouldered man with a merchant's fine coat and a demagogue's practiced voice, who stood on an overturned cart shouting about orc raiders and stolen grazing land, and the need for the town to make an example before the crowned soldiers arrived to spoil their justice with tedious questions of evidence. Gorza did not hesitate. She rode directly into the square, dismounted in one fluid motion, and strode through the parting crowd toward the chained young man with a confidence that dared anyone present to stand in her way. "Release him," she said, her voice carrying clear and hard across the square. The merchant on the cart sneered down at her. "And who are you to demand anything, orc? This creature stole grazing rights that—" "This man," Gorza said, cutting him off, "has committed no crime that a fine and an apology could not settle, and you know it, because if he had truly raided your caravan or harmed any of your people, you would have killed him on the spot rather than dragging him half a day to make theater of his punishment before a crowd you have spent an hour whipping into a frenzy for your own amusement." A murmur ran through the crowd, not entirely hostile, John noted with cautious hope, some faces showing the first flicker of doubt. "You have no authority here," the merchant snapped. "I have this," Gorza said, and drew her long knife in one smooth motion, the crowd gasping and surging back as she strode to the chained man's side, and before anyone could stop her, brought the blade down not against flesh but against the heavy iron chain binding his wrists, striking the weak link with a single, precise blow that snapped it clean through. The square erupted into shouting. Several men in the crowd surged forward, and for one terrible, suspended moment John thought the whole thing would collapse into violence, dozens against two, an unwinnable fight in the middle of a hostile town. He did not think. He simply moved, placing himself directly between the surging crowd and Gorza and the freed young orc man, arms spread, using the only weapon he had ever truly possessed in any fight, his voice, and the plain, unshakable conviction of a man who had learned over the past 14 months exactly what he was willing to stand for. "Look at him," John shouted, loud enough to carry over the crowd's noise, pointing at the young orc man now cradling his freed wrists. "Does he look like a raider to you? Or does he look like a frightened boy who wandered onto contested grazing land and got dragged here to be a scapegoat for a merchant who wants an excuse for violence rather than the tedious work of settling a boundary dispute properly?" He turned, sweeping his gaze across the crowd, searching for the doubtful faces he had glimpsed a moment before. "I have seen what real raiders do to a village. I fought them at Scarrow's Reach a year past, alongside soldiers and fisherfolk and orcs together, because when real danger comes, it does not care what shape anyone's ears are. This man is not your enemy. Your enemy is standing on that cart, telling you fear is easier than justice. The crowd's mood, so violently certain a moment before, wavered visibly. The merchant, sensing the shift, tried to rally them again, shouting something about traitors and orclovers, but his voice had lost its earlier power, and several men who had surged forward now hesitated, looking between John and Gorza and the merchant with the first stirrings of shame. It was Captain Voss, arriving at that exact moment with a small detachment of soldiers, summoned, as it turned out, by the same frightened fishermen who had first brought word of the capture, who had ridden onward to Millhaven's garrison after alerting the Reach, who finally broke the tension entirely, striding into the square with the unmistakable authority of crown soldiery. "This is now a crown matter," she announced, silencing the square with a few sharp words. "This man will be held for a proper hearing, with witnesses from both parties, and if there is a legitimate grazing dispute to settle, it will be settled through the town magistrate rather than a mob with a merchant for a conductor." She fixed the caravan leader with a hard look. "You will want to consider very carefully, sir, whether inciting a riot in a crown town is truly worth whatever grazing rights are in dispute." The crowd dispersed slowly, shamefaced, and the young orc man, who gave his name, shaking as Talric, a herder from a small clan settlement 2 days' ride north, was taken into the garrison's custody for the promised hearing rather than the mob's rough justice. John learned, some weeks later, that the hearing had gone in Talric's favor entirely. The grazing dispute revealed to be exactly the manufactured excuse Gorza had guessed it to be. The merchant fined heavily for his conduct. But it was the moment itself, there in the square, that John would remember most clearly for the rest of his life. The image of Gorza striding through a hostile crowd without a flicker of fear, cutting a stranger's chains with a single decisive stroke in open defiance of dozens of furious onlookers, and himself standing at her side, arms spread, adding his voice to hers, the two of them together turning back a mob that neither could have stopped alone. "You could have been killed," John said later, once they had ridden clear of Millhaven and made camp for the night along the coast road, still shaking faintly with the aftermath of it all. "So could you," Gorza said, standing in front of a crowd with nothing but your voice for a shield. "Do not lecture me about risk, Saltman, when you did the exact same fool thing at my side." "I was not lecturing," John said. "I was admiring. I do not think I have ever loved you more than I did in that square watching you cut those chains." Gorza's fierce expression softened, and she pulled him close beside their small campfire, tusks brushing his temple. "We did that together," she said quietly. "That is what I want, John. Not a wife who waits safely at home while her husband faces the world's dangers, nor a husband who stands meekly aside while his wife fights every battle alone. I want this. Whatever comes, we face it together, side by side or not at all." "Side by side," John agreed. "Always." They returned to Scarrow's Reach 2 days later to find the whole settlement had already heard some garbled version of the tale a young orc man freed from chains in open defiance of a furious mob in Millhaven Square, a human traitor standing at the fierce orc woman's side against dozens. And the story had done more, in its retelling along the coast road over the following weeks, to soften old prejudices in the region than a dozen years of quiet coexistence might have managed. Talric himself visited the Reach some months later, bringing gifts of tanned hide and dried meat in gratitude, and stayed 3 days as an honored guest. And John watched Gorza's face as she told the young herder the story of the doorframe carving, watched her laugh freely at her own long-past embarrassment, and understood that whatever wound her exile from her original clan had left in her had healed, finally and completely, in the life they had built together on this windswept island. Autumn came, and then winter, the causeway growing treacherous with ice at the tide's edges, the cottage warm against the cold with a second room added on through the summer's work, the doorframe with its 2 carved names weathering gray with salt and wind but the letters themselves, cut deep into the old wood, showing no sign of fading. John's trading trips grew shorter and less frequent as the settlement itself grew, drawing enough commerce that he found he could conduct much of his business from the reach itself, rather than the long mountain roads that had once been his whole life. Gorza's reputation as the woman who had helped break the Skinner band and freed a chained innocent before a furious crowd spread far enough that clan messengers occasionally passed through the region, and John watched, one cold afternoon in early winter, as one such messenger arrived at their door with news that made Gorza go very still. "Your father," the messenger said, an older orc woman with weathered features and a formal bearing, "wishes it known that he has heard of your deeds in this region. He does not ask you to return. He asks only that you know his exile of you was spoken in anger he has long regretted, and that the door of his camp, should you ever wish to cross it again, stands open." Gorza said nothing for a long moment after the messenger departed, standing very still at the window, staring out at the gray winter sea. "Do you wish to go?" John asked quietly, coming to stand beside her, careful not to push. "I do not know," she admitted. "For 3 years I told myself I did not care what my father thought, that his judgment meant nothing beside my own certainty that I had done right in refusing that marriage. And now that his door stands open, I find myself unable to simply dismiss it as I always told myself I would." She turned to look at him, uncertainty plain on her fierce features in a way that still, after all this time, struck him as a rare and precious sight. "This is my home now, this island, this cottage, I do not wish to leave it even briefly, even to see my father again." "Then do not go alone," John said. "If you wish to see him, I will ride with you. If you do not wish to go at all, we will send word that his door is noted and appreciated, and leave it at that. Whatever you decide, Gorza, I am not asking you to choose between your father and this life. I am only asking you to choose whatever will let you sleep easiest at night." In the end, they rode together the following spring, once the mountain passes cleared enough for safe travel, to the eastern hills where Gorza's original clan still kept their camp. The reunion was not without its tension. Her father, a broad, gray-bearded orc with the same fierce amber eyes as his daughter, greeted her with a stiff formality that took 2 full days to thaw into something like genuine warmth, and there were clan members who eyed John with open suspicion that took considerably longer than 2 days to ease. But by the time they departed, a week later, something had healed that had needed healing for 3 long years, and Gorza rode back toward Scarrow's Reach with a lightness John had not seen in her before, a peace settling over old wounds that had, until that visit, quietly ached beneath her fierce exterior. "Well?" John asked, as the familiar shape of the Tide Island came into view on the horizon, the ruined watchtower and the scattered cottages, and somewhere among them their own home with its carved doorframe waiting. "Was it worth the journey?" "It was," Gorza said, "though I find I am glad to be riding toward home again, rather than away from it." She glanced sideways at him, something warm and certain in her expression. "This is home now, John Sutton, wherever we are as long as it is together, but especially there on that windswept rock with our names carved side by side. I did not think 3 years ago, chained by my own stubbornness and my father's anger, that I would ever again feel as certain of anywhere as I feel certain of that small stone cottage." They crossed the causeway at low tide, the familiar rhythm of the water welcoming them home, and that evening, standing together beneath the doorframe with its weathered, permanent proof of everything they had built, Gorza pulled John close and kissed him with all the fierce tenderness that had, over 2 years, become as familiar and necessary to him as breathing. "I love you," she said, simple and unguarded, the words she had once told him no one had ever offered her freely. "Not despite anything. Not because you rescued me from some danger, or because I rescued you from that cliff, though the gods know we have saved each other more times than I can easily count since. I love you because you are exactly who you are, patient and brave in your own quiet way, and willing to stand at my side even when a whole square full of angry strangers would have preferred you did not. I chose you, John Sutton, and I would choose you again, every single day, for as long as the tide keeps turning. I chose you too, John said, voice rough with feeling. Every single day since that first morning, when I woke to a knife at my throat and found the most magnificent woman I had ever seen glaring down at me. I would fall off that cliff 100 times over, Gorza Darkwolf, if it meant landing here with you every single time. They stood together a long moment in the gathering dusk, the sound of the sea steady and eternal beyond the causeway, the carved names on the doorframe behind them catching the last light of the day. And then, as had become their habit on quiet evenings when the day's work was done and nothing remained but each other, they went inside together and closed the door against the wind, and were, at last and always, exactly where they belonged. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and Scarrow's Reach grew steadily into a settlement known along the whole coast road not for its isolation or its half-orc population, but for its stubborn, hard-won Pisa place, where a human trader and an orc warrior had once stood together against outlaws and mobs alike, and where their example, small and personal as it had begun, had rippled outward into something larger than either of them could have predicted on that first storm-battered night, when John Sutton woke to find a knife at his throat, and though neither of them knew it yet, the beginning of the only home he would ever truly need.